"You cannot stop me. I spend 30,000 men a month." Such was the ominous proclamation of Napoleon to his rivals. It was said at a time when France, unique among its contemporaries, raised millions of men to wage vast wars which burned across Europe and beyond. Yet, while the revolution had been the first to unlock the mass mobilization of the French population, it would be Napoleon who molded them into an efficient weapon, which he wielded to devastating effect, both at the strategic and tactical level. This concept was epitomized by the formation of the Grande Armée and its system of flexible combined arms corps, capable of independent operations across a massive front. But to understand these systems, we must bring them to life. From the organization of the smallest section to the largest brigade, their formations in battle, and beyond. This is the true size of Napoleon's army.
Today's video was brought to you by Opera. They offer a free desktop browser that makes navigating the internet so much easier, faster, safer, and smarter, especially compared to your default options. So one of my favorite things is the tab islands, which lets you organize your open tabs. This is a godsend, as I routinely have a bajillion tabs open as I pour through online papers, art references, and other materials for documentaries. Now I can easily group these tabs for work, for documentaries, for personal use, how I want them. It's very modular, easy to expand, collapse, reorganize, and shift them as needed, and bookmark all of these as you go along. Opera users now also get access to Aria, a free AI service, which is built into the experience. So you can highlight any text on screen to explore, explain, or translate a selection, or alternatively, you can open a sidebar to ask Aria to answer questions and generate content with real-time access to the web. For instance, while researching this episode, I was able to get some fast clarifications on the difference between a Fusilier and Chasseur infantry unit. The AI gave me a great comparison on their historical origin, function, and purpose with a nice summary at the end. Opera also comes with a built-in ad blocker as well as a VPN, with no need for additional extensions. You can also integrate music streaming and messages into your browser, so if you want to experience the internet safer, faster, and smarter, then definitely go ahead and check out Opera One in the link in the description. Check it out, enjoy, and I'll see you in the video.
Before we begin, it must be admitted that the scope of Napoleon's army is extremely difficult to cover. While we will do our best to piece together its building blocks to scale in true size, it will be beneficial to first ground our understanding with a simplified explanation. At the highest level was the French Imperial Army, which consisted of the Empire's entire land force branch. This behemoth was broken out into various commands and organizations. The largest of these was the Grande Armée, led by Napoleon himself. Though it evolved over time, the Grande Armée can be approximately modelled as containing the Imperial Guard, the Cavalry Reserve, and about 6 Army Corps. These were new, innovative organizations meant to act as mini-armies with reduced administrative and logistical needs, capable of independent operations for greater strategic flexibility. Each was a combined arms force of about 25,000 men. Here we have shown its 2 to 4 infantry divisions, the cavalry division, the artillery brigade, as well as its engineer and support groups. Given that the infantry are the most numerous, we will first delve into their ranks. Here is a roadmap of their organizational structure. If you'd like to pause the video, please do so now. But without further delay, let us begin with the first building block. At the lowest level, French soldiers lived together in groups called Ordinaire, usually 14 to 16 strong, and led by a corporal. This group would share a large common tent or 2 smaller tents. On the rare occasion tents were available. Most of the time, though, the men bivouacked in improvised straw and wood shelters or under the stars, or were billeted on households along the line of march. In camp, they also shared a common soup kettle, into which the men would contribute their rations for shared meals. The corporal would handle the shopping for supplies as well as the hiring of washerwomen. 4 squads would form a section with a total of about 60 men, 4 corporals, and perhaps a half-dozen tents. In combat, however, these 4 squads would be rearranged into 3 lines. Within this battle line, each soldier was allotted 1 French pace, or 0.65 meters for proper spacing. The first rank would fire from a kneeling position, while those of the second rank fired while standing above them. Meanwhile, the third rank stood close behind to receive spent muskets, reload them, and cycle them back to the front. Alternatively, the third rank might be detached and sent ahead of the force as skirmishers. When casualties were high, the men of this third rank would be pulled to the front to maintain the width of the unit. By 1813, the French army was so depleted that Napoleon would actually issue an order adopting the 2-rank battle line as a standard. Yet, the extent to which this was adopted in the midst of a hard-fought campaign is not well understood. Next up the organization, 2 sections would come together to form a company of about 120 privates and 8 corporals. This unit would be led by a captain, along with an additional command staff that consisted of a lieutenant, a sous-lieutenant, a sergeant major, 4 sergeants, a fourrier, and 2 drummers. Most of these officers would have had a non-combatant servant called a domestique, resulting in about 5 to 10 such individuals per company. In addition, lieutenants and captains were allowed horses if they were over 50, though not many lived that long in the wars of the empire. To account for this, our model will assume 2 horse spares. For shelter, we will also assume that our company has about 18 tents between the men and officers. Within the French army, a company was an administrative unit whose command staff would be expected to see to the proper maintenance of its men. For instance, the fourrier managed the procurement and distribution of his unit's supplies. As such, we might expect such officers to have been educated men from the upper echelons of society. This was certainly the case for most armies of the era, whose wealthy classes often bought their commissions. However, the French had largely done away with this system following the Revolution, and by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, promotions were largely merit-based. Thus, among these ranks, we would actually expect to see a more representative slice of society. At this point, we should also note that the men of each of these administrative companies would also double as a combat unit known as the platoon. For the sake of this video, though, we shall continue to refer to them as companies to limit confusion. In battle, this force arrayed its men into 3 lines, with the first section on the right flank and the second section on the left flank. The 4 corporals of each section stood in each corner of either formation to help guide the rank-and-file troops. The captain, meanwhile, led the entire company from his own file on the far right. However, given that such units measured roughly 30 meters across, the remainder of the command staff would be spread out along its width, 2 paces from the troops, to maintain proper alignment. Flags helped the men visually remain in good order, while drums audibly kept them in sync. At the next organizational level, multiple companies would be joined into a battalion. This was the most common tactical unit on the Napoleonic battlefield. As such, it could come in many shapes and sizes, with both the type and number of companies in a battalion varying over time. With regards to type, there were light and line infantry, each with their own subtypes, loosely graded on height. For instance, the light troops were broken out into the voltigeurs, the chasseurs à pied, and the carabiniers, while the regular troops were broken out into the fusiliers and the grenadiers. Generally speaking, the light troops acted as skirmishers, while the regular troops fought in the main battle line. However, in practice, they received much the same training and often saw their roles overlap in combat. In 1808, we might find the following battalions in common use. A French light infantry battalion with 1 company of voltigeurs, 4 companies of chasseurs, and 1 company of carabiniers. A French line infantry battalion with 1 company of voltigeurs, 4 companies of fusiliers, and 1 company of grenadiers. For our purposes, we will now look more closely at one of these typical line infantry battalions. Here we see its 6 companies, totaling about 720 soldiers and 114 officers, whose organization we previously defined. Added to them is a command staff led by a mounted chef de bataillon and his assistants, the adjutant major and 2 adjutant sub-officers. Once more, each of these men will have their own domestique, which we assume total about 5 such non-combatants. The unit also had its own flag bearer, who proudly displayed the identity of his unit. In terms of support, each battalion would have an ammunition wagon and a ration wagon, each manned by a pair of drivers as well as 4 pack horses to carry various baggage. But perhaps most important would be 4 women known as the cantinières. Considered absolutely necessary to the functioning of the army and mandated by consular decree, they sold food and drink to the troops while handling many other day-to-day needs of the men, such as clothes washing and repair. To ensure good order, these women had to be licensed by the army and were usually married to soldiers in the unit. Zooming back out to consider our entire battalion, we see that it has roughly 720 soldiers, 120 officers, 60 support staff, 16 horses, 2 wagons, and about 110 tents. In combat, a battalion might adopt the following formations: line, column, and square. Let's quickly review each of these. A 6-company battalion in line formation appeared as follows. The elite voltigeurs and grenadier companies protect the flanks, while the 4 fusilier companies take up the center. Each maintains roughly 2 paces of spacing to prevent collisions. The battalion's officers, meanwhile, are dispersed across the formation's 200-meter front. In the center, the bannerman proudly waves the flag meant to serve as a visual and psychological anchor for the force. It is protected by the men of the Fagnon's Guard. About 15 meters behind them rides the chef de bataillon, who has the best view of the entire unit. Besides him are the drummers drawn up from each company. Flanking him, about 20 meters on either side, are the adjutant and sous-adjutant majors who supervise each wing. At the extreme ends of the line are one of each flank company sergeants who acts as a guide général. When the order to advance comes, they and the first rank of the Fagnon's Guard will step out in front of the entire battalion, set up the alignment of the men, and signal back to the commander that he can now give the final order to march. However, it is extremely difficult to keep such long lines of men in good order, even in the best of conditions. Thus it was that they often formed into columns for more rapid movement. A column could take many forms depending on the situation. Variables included the frontage and the depth of the formation. Generally speaking, the smaller the front, the more quick and mobile the force. For instance, march columns typically adopted a 3-man frontage to squeeze into the available road. However, this came at the cost of forward-facing firepower and an increased vulnerability to artillery fire. Thus, in combat, attack columns traded depth for frontage. In this case, we have chosen a battalion with a 2-company frontage, also confusingly referred to as a division, and a half-interval depth. Here we see the 4 fusilier companies making up the front 2 divisions, while the elite voltigeurs and grenadier companies making up the rear division. In width, they measure 70 meters, and depth, they measure 70 meters. The chef de bataillon and the drummers likely take up the rear, while his adjutant and sous-adjutant majors supervise the 1st and last division. This formation was often a favorite of commanders on the attack. Its frontage maintained a useful balance of speed and firepower, while its half-interval spacing left large enough of a gap to reduce the damage of artillery fire, but small enough of a gap that the men of the rear could quickly be brought up to evolve the formation. In most cases, this meant switching from column into line just before joining battle against other infantry. Yet the column could easily transform into a square to repel cavalry. This would be done by having the 2 companies of the middle division wheeled to either side. Hence the half-interval depth, which left a company-sized gap for such situations. With the 3 sides of the box thus formed, the last division had merely to advance to complete its defences. Overall, the completed square formation measured roughly 70 metres wide and 40 metres deep. From here, the men could present a dense wall of bristling bayonets to dissuade all but the bravest horse and rider from charging while firing at any troops mounted or on foot who dared approach. The process of forming this square was said to take just 30 seconds on the parade ground. Even if the battlefield conditions caused some delay, it was certainly a rapid maneuver. Thus we see how the battalion, the main tactical infantry unit of the French army, could be efficiently wielded by its commanders. Yet, such groups did not act alone, and Napoleon's infantry often found themselves grouped into even larger units for both administrative and combat purposes. Next up the organizational ladder was a regiment. In 1808, a French regiment consisted of 5 battalions, 4 of which were war battalions, with the final one being a depot battalion, whose purpose was to remain behind to collect, equip, and train new recruits before marching them to the front. Thus, a regiment rarely found itself marshalled together in one place, and even the 4 war battalions often found themselves dispersed in the chaos of a campaign. Given these realities, we will actually be modelling the more likely battlefield strength of a regiment by assuming it deploys with just 2 of its 5 battalions. Using our prior figures, it numbers about 1,440 soldiers, 240 officers, 120 support staff, 32 horses, 4 wagons, and 220 tents. Added to this was a regimental headquarters and a small baggage train. Let us take a closer look at each of these. A regiment's field headquarters of about 25 included its colonel, paymaster, eagle-bearers, musicians, and surgeons. The colonel commanded the regiment, or as many battalions of the regiment as were present. The paymaster, naturally enough, distributed pay. The eagle-bearers carried the regiment's imperial standards, which had been personally distributed by Napoleon himself in imitation of the ancient Roman practice of the legionary eagles. These standards were held with great honour and pride by the 1st Battalion of a regiment. The eagle-bearer himself was a lieutenant who was flanked by 2 halberd-wielding sergeants and backed up by a furrier from each of the 1st Battalion's 6 companies. Nearby stood the regiment's musicians, who were led by its drum major, the drum corporal, and bandmaster, with 7 bandsmen. Meanwhile, a surgeon major led the regiment's medical services with 4 assistant surgeons and 5 sub-assistants. With regards to the baggage train, the regiment had a wagon for shoes, a wagon for baggage, and at least 1 wagon for the medical staff. In combat, all could have doubled as transports for the wounded. A sutler woman with her own wagon serviced the regimental headquarters. The regiment's colonel, meanwhile, had his own support elements in the form of 2 servants, 3 riding horses, 3 pack horses, a wagon with 2 draft horses and 2 drivers. Between the personnel of the field headquarters and the baggage train, we might assume about 10 additional tents. Thus, altogether, a regiment numbered about 1,440 soldiers, 260 officers, 130 support staff, 44 horses, 8 wagons, and 230 tents. At the next organizational level was the brigade. However, unlike our prior units, this force was purely a tactical group with no administrative function. During a campaign, various regiments would be brigaded together as deemed necessary for the mission at hand. As such, their strength varied, typically ranging anywhere from about 2,500 to 5,500 men. For our purposes, we will model a brigade with 3 of our previously defined regiments, for a total of 6 battalions. Using our prior figures, it numbers about 4,320 soldiers, 780 officers, 350 support staff, 132 horses, 24 wagons, and 690 tents. Beyond this, brigades had minimal headquarters and support staff owing to their purely tactical role. We will thus assume that its new elements consist only of a brigadier general, his aide, as well as a few servants, horses, and wagons. Altogether, this bumps up our head count for the brigade negligibly. Ultimately, it was a massive force, roughly equivalent in size to a Roman legion. Any larger force would begin to severely tax the command and control capabilities of the era. Thus, in the French armies of the Napoleonic Wars, a brigade stood as the largest pure infantry unit. When deployed for battle, it would typically do so with each of the battalions formed into their own column of attack. To avoid being shot, these would often seek cover or even lay prone until it came time to advance. When the order to attack was received, the battalions moved rapidly towards their objective, being sure to maintain proper spacing so as to avoid entanglement and cannon fire. Only at the last minute would French doctrine dictate that they deploy into a line, unleashing fire across a 630-meter front, or simply plow through the enemy with a bayonet charge. Such were the efficient, aggressive tactics which won Napoleon his wars. But this is only part of the story. We have yet to cover the units of cavalry and the artillery, let alone the greater combined arms groups which made up the infamous French Army Corp. Join us next time as we continue to explore the true size of Napoleon's army. You can catch script previews and download all our art by becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon. A huge thanks to our current supporters and the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.